By the spring of 1860, the Mississippi Delta wore two faces. In daylight, heat shimmered over flat acres of cotton like a veil, cicadas grinding out a steady hymn as if the land itself were breathing. At dusk, that veil dropped and the fields darkened into a mass of silhouettes, and rumor rose that seemed to march into infinity. A horizon pinned by cypress and the bruise-colored line of the river. Delaney Plantation stood small against that expanse. 200 acres, a weather-lean house of timber settling unevenly on its brick piers, and a family balanced on debts they would not name. The whitewash was chalking away from the boards. The porch rail had a loosened spindle where a previous season's wind had worried it near loose. Windows clouded at the edges where moisture pressed inward. The house did not complain, houses rarely do, but every hinge and floorboard gave testimony. Something was wearing out. Clement Delaney did his best not to hear it. At 45, he had the look of a man who mistook motion for progress. Shoulders squared, jaw forward, hands calloused in a way that made him feel practical, virtuous, different from the grand men upriver who ordered profits from a veranda. He worked rows in a frayed hat beside the people he owned and called that proximity fairness. In town he called it grit. In his own ledger he called it necessity. Next to his entries of seed, gin repairs, flour, molasses, and the cost of hauling bales to the levee, he had begun to make smaller notations that did not belong to farming numbers that multiplied in secret columns and would not stop. His wife, Joanna, had once carried sunlight with her. Now the light seemed to hang back when she entered a room. 38 and prematurely grey at the temples, she moved like a woman afraid to knock anything over, careful with her hands, careful with her voice. She had delivered 4 children and buried one. The 3 daughters who remained were the sort neighbors complimented before letting silence fold over whatever came next. Arlene, 19, with her mother's golden hair, and a gaze that could cut right through a person when she felt safe enough to lift it. Caroline, 17, slight and fine-boned, beauty made fragile by frequent fevers. Frida, 15, all restless energy and quick laughter, as if she hadn't yet learned the house's new habit of whispering. 15 enslaved people labored on the land. 8 men and 7 women, names the ledgers tried to hold, lives the ledgers could never hold. Tobias, about 30, had the steadiness that made others look to him before they decided how afraid to be. Laia, 25, worked in the big house with a competence that let everything seem ordinary even when it wasn't. Most had been born on the place. Most could point to corners of the property where their childhoods still lived like hidden caches of sweetness. A creek bend where someone's mother had taught them to swim. A pecan tree that dropped nuts into a skirt. A cleared patch that smelled of crushed mint when cut. Clement liked to think that meant loyalty. It really meant roots. Roots know the soil's history better than the planter. 2 bad harvests in a row had knocked the air out of the place. Boll rot in 58. Storms that laid cotton flat in 59. Clement had ridden into New Orleans with his hat pulled low and borrowed at terms that seemed survivable at the bar and predatory in daylight. A man in a linen coat he couldn't quite remember by name had explained the interest calmly, almost kindly, pointing with a pen to columns that curved like a future in which Clement could not fall behind. But he did fall behind, and if a couple of nights each month he sat at a back table where lamp-black smoke softened everyone's edges, if he felt cards and coin might give him an exit that the fields would not, well, didn't a man deserve a lever? By the fall of 59, other men began turning up on the lane in dustless coats and tidy boots, men who knew how to smile while talking about executions that had nothing to do with gallows. On those afternoons, Joanna set tea and kept the girls out of the front room. When the door closed, the house held its breath, and after the door opened again, Clement would go to his office and sit with his ledger, until even the moths were tired of the lamp. He would draw lines in pencil, erase them, redraw them straighter. Sometimes he would press the eraser so hard the paper thinned. The girls learned to walk softly past that room. Even laughter became a kind of waste. He began to inspect everything differently. In the fields, his eyes no longer saw rows but capacities: how many planted, how many picked, how many lost to storm or fungus, or a day of someone's fever. At the table, his gaze flicked like a tally across plates, portions, appetites. He took notes, as if note-taking could repair a world. Once, when he believed no one was looking, he watched his daughters with the same evaluative glance he gave the mules. Arlene felt it strike her cheek like a cold hand. She said nothing. Caroline ate more slowly. Frida tried to tell a joke and mistimed the punchline. No one laughed, which made the misfire worse. Joanna set her fork down and folded her napkin over it, buying a quiet she could not keep. The plantation was not grand enough to hide itself. That was the problem. Big places had distances that could swallow secrets, people enough to explain away noise. Here, everything arrived, right at the edge of everything else. When Clement had the carpenter add a second bolt to a bedroom door, neighbors noticed the nail barrels on the porch. When he turned callers away at the gate, they noticed the new habit. Times are unsettled, he said. Politics. That word traveled more easily than any other in 1860 and excused much that ought to have been examined. It excused this too. Dr. Reuben McCormick came by with his little leather bag in April and found the air of the house changed, heavier somehow, like a storm organizing itself above the roof. He could not diagnose weather. He saw only what was set in front of him. A mother with tired eyes, a daughter who flinched at sudden sounds, another whose pulse ran too quick beneath his fingers. He asked Clement the questions men asked one another to prove they were good neighbors. How is the planting? Any fever among the hands? How's your credit? Clement answered politely, too politely, refusing eye contact except when he had to pin the doctor with a smile that said the conversation was over. On his way out, McCormick noticed new locks on interior doors and told himself there had been a burglary, or that people who owed too much sometimes became careful in odd directions. A man can explain anything to himself if it lets him keep moving. Once a week, in the evenings, Clement brought borrowed law books into his office, property codes, inheritance, parish record-keeping rules, even a battered treatise on the old colonial doctrine that said a child took the condition of its mother. He read with the focus of a man who believed words were a ladder. Outside, crickets pulsed like a heartbeat. Inside, pages turned and turned again. When Joanna stepped into the doorway, he slid papers into the desk with the quickness of a teenager. Nothing, he said, and because she had learned that nothing held more danger than some confessions, she nodded and left him to it. In town, the talk around him grew sharper. Cotton prices, federal elections, militias drilling on Sundays down by the warehouses. Men grew loud at tables, then soft, then loud again. Clement discovered that if he steered the talk toward methods and margins, toward the mechanics of managing human resources, even men accustomed to brutality looked away. He took this, wrongly, as proof that he was simply more practical than they were. In truth, it was a warning he refused to read. Meanwhile, the land kept offering up its indifferent cycles, honeysuckle in the fence lines, river fog that rolled in like a pale animal and lay down on the fields, frogs calling after midnight. Tobias guided the crews at first light with the patient timing of a drummer. Leah moved through Joanna's kitchen, laying out bread, salt pork, coffee, then scrubbed the table the way she'd been taught and the way her mother had before her, though no scrub could lift the film that settled over a room to which fear had been invited. Something else settled with it, a rhythm, days that repeated with slight wrongness. Clement walking the perimeter and stopping where no fence needed mending. The girls taking turns at the piano and letting pieces trail off mid-phrase. Joanna standing too long at an upstairs window and only afterward remembering what she'd meant to do. In a story later told, people would say the end began with a discovery in a law book, or with a letter delivered in a grey envelope, or with a dead crop that forced a desperate man to choose. But stories are rarely kind enough to give us a single beginning. The end had already entered the house. It came in on the soles of boots and in the creases of paper, and it sat down at the table, and it waited for the moment when someone would mistake arithmetic for salvation. On a warm Sunday, when even the wasps moved slowly across the porch rafters, Clement walked back from the office with a ledger under his arm and paused at the doorway to watch his family. Joanna's hands were in a bowl of flour, the white dust making a soft cloud around her wrists. Arlene had tied her hair up with a dark ribbon and was reading by the window. Caroline had fallen asleep with her cheek against a folded shawl. Frida had slipped outside and was balanced on the top step, squinting into the glare like a girl who still believed brightness might pick her. In Clement's mind, columns and cycles and possibilities arranged themselves as neatly as soldiers at attention. From that distance, without the mess of breath and feeling, everything was orderly, profitable, even. The house creaked. A wasp settled. Somewhere in the quarters, a child laughed and then cut it short, taught by experience that loud joy could be mistaken for insolence. Clement tipped his ledger a little higher against his ribs, as if to keep its numbers from spilling back out onto the floor, and went inside to add a new line. The book was heavy today. He told himself that was only paper. He told himself paper could float a man across bad water. He did not notice, would not notice that the water was already over the sill. By winter, Delaney Plantation had gone quiet in the way fever quiets a body just before it breaks. There were no outbursts, no open quarrels, only the muffled hum of people pretending life was still ordinary. The cotton bales were stacked like mute witnesses beside the gin house, waiting for a buyer who never came. Inside, every sound seemed to fall into the same hush. The scrape of Clement's chair against the floorboards, the tick of the mantel clock, the breath of the wind through warped window panes. Clement spent most evenings locked in his office. The family had learned the pattern. First, the click of the key in the door, then the smell of tobacco and candle wax seeping through the crack beneath it. If anyone passed by, they might hear the low rasp of paper being turned, or the scratch of a pen moving over ledgers. Sometimes he muttered phrases broken by arithmetic, like prayer misquoted, interest at 10%, 3 shares of, then silence, then collateral. Joanna tried to pretend it was ordinary bookkeeping, the kind every planter did in hard years. But Clement's notebooks had multiplied. He now kept 3, one of them bound in dark leather and hidden beneath a false drawer bottom. She discovered it once by accident, glimpsed a page before he snatched it away. She saw only fragments of words: valuation, progeny, inheritance risk. None of them belonged to the language of crops. Dr. McCormick noticed the change too. He had been summoned in late November to tend a feverish slave child. But what struck him was not the illness, it was the owner's new intensity. Clement had become inquisitive in a way the doctor found unsettling. He pressed McCormick about childbirth, about how often a woman could safely bear children, and whether there were methods to ensure success. When the doctor stammered something about the natural limits of the body, Clement nodded slowly, as if confirming an experiment's parameters. In the evenings, Joanna felt the house watching her. She would sit by the parlor fire with her sewing, listening to the slow groan of the rafters, and wonder if the building itself was holding its breath. Once, when Arlene reached to add wood to the fire, the flames flared and revealed the outline of Clement's figure in the doorway, half in shadow, just watching them. "You startled me," Joanna said. Clement smiled without showing his teeth. "You jumped too easily, Joe." Then he stepped back into darkness and closed the door behind him. He had begun to speak differently, each word measured, as if he were testing the weight of everything before letting it fall. The warmth that once softened his tone with the girls had drained away. When Caroline coughed, he asked about her appetite, not with concern, but with an appraiser's curiosity. When Frida complained about sleeplessness, he took notes on a scrap of paper, nodding to himself. Joanna caught him watching their daughters at breakfast, his eyes moving from plate to plate, calculating portions, growth, health. She shivered without knowing why. The girls tried to make sense of it in whispers. Arlene, the eldest, told her sisters it was only money worries. "He's frightened," she said, "so he counts everything, even us." Caroline wanted to believe that. Frida didn't. She said she'd seen their father in the yard one evening, standing over Tobias with a lantern, asking him questions about the slave women who was strong, who had borne children, whose children survived. Tobias had answered cautiously, eyes lowered, and Clement had written notes, as though this were just another inventory. When Joanna confronted him about the ledgers, Clement dismissed her concerns with irritation. "You wouldn't understand," he said. "You worry about curtains and recipes while I carry the weight of this house." Then softer, as if the anger itself needed to be hidden, "Do you want to see your daughters hungry?" She didn't answer. The question wasn't really a question. That winter, a strange new order took hold on the plantation. Clement reorganized the slave quarters, moving some families into separate cabins, pairing others differently. He said it was to prevent quarrels, but even the enslaved could tell it had no logic beyond his whim. He installed locks on the inside doors of the big house as well. "Protection," he explained when the sheriff came by on a routine visit. Sheriff Mullins nodded, accepting the answer the way polite men did in 1860, preferring to avoid what could not be comfortably discussed. Joanna began to record her own observations in secret. She kept a small journal between the pages of her Bible, written in the careful script of someone afraid the paper might one day testify against her. "He studies at night," she wrote. "He asks about childbirth. He speaks of the girl's health as if it were a measure. There is a sickness here that has no fever." She didn't know what the sickness meant yet, only that it was spreading. At church, Clement sat stiffer than before, his face carved into the kind of composure that made neighbors speak of him as a man, under strain but steady. When Reverend Porter preached on the wages of sin, Clement bowed his head more deeply than anyone. To strangers, that humility looked like devotion. To Joanna, it looked like strategy. The girls still found small ways to resist the heaviness. Arlene read novels by candlelight, stories of distant cities, women in dresses finer than hers, men who looked at them with gentleness. Caroline played piano, soft enough that the notes trembled in the air but never carried to the locked door of their father's study. Freda lingered by the slave quarters to listen to Liars singing low, rhythmic tunes that had crossed the ocean generations ago and somehow still carried comfort. But even those sounds began to fade, smothered by fear. In February, Clement returned from New Orleans with a leather briefcase and a change in his eyes that no one could name. The girls asked if he'd brought them sweets. He told them sweets were for people who could afford them. Then he locked himself in his office for 2 days. When he emerged, his hands were ink-stained and trembling. "Things will improve soon," he told Joanna. "I've found a solution." He didn't explain what problem he meant or who would pay the cost of solving it. That night, Joanna dreamed of the river rising. She was standing at the porch rail, watching the black water swell toward the steps. Clement stood beside her with his ledger open, calmly counting as the current took fence posts and chickens and finally the porch itself. She woke before it reached her feet, but the sound of rushing water stayed in her ears long after. By early spring, the air grew thick again, the season of planting, and the season when Clement's madness began to take shape. He had started reading aloud fragments from his law books, to no one in particular. Partus sequitur ventrum, Joanna heard him say one night, the Latin rolling strange in his mouth. He repeated it, slower, as though savoring the syllables. The phrase meant nothing to her then. To him, it meant everything. The seed of an idea that would twist law, blood, and family into a single monstrous equation. Down in the quarters, the enslaved could feel the shift without hearing the words. Tobias told Liar quietly, "He's planning something. The way he watches, the way he asks, he's measuring people like fields." Liar shuddered. "Then maybe the harvest he wants ain't cotton." Tobias said nothing. Some truths were too heavy to say aloud. When Joanna passed her husband's office one evening, the door was ajar. Candlelight fell across his desk, illuminating neat stacks of paper and the open law book he'd been studying for months. She saw a drawing crude but unmistakable of the property, with small rectangles marked along the slave quarters and another set sketched nearer the house. Special rooms, the margin read. She stepped back quietly before he saw her. The door clicked shut behind her, and she felt the walls close in as if the house itself understood what she had just glimpsed. That was the night she stopped writing in her journal. Some knowledge is safer unrecorded. She closed the Bible around it and hid it beneath the floorboard near her bed. Outside, the frogs had begun their spring chorus. Inside, Clement returned to his desk, dipping his pen in ink and whispering the same Latin words again and again, like a charm against ruin. Partus sequitur ventrum. The child follows the condition of the mother. He underlined it once, twice, until the paper tore. Then he smiled faintly because for the first time in months, he believed he had found a way out. In the silence that followed, the only sound was the slow turning of pages, numbers rearranging themselves in the dark, preparing to swallow everything human left in that house. The words stayed with him like a fever. Partus sequitur ventrem. The child follows the condition of the mother. Clement whispered it as if it were a prayer, though what he worshipped now was not God but loophole. The Latin sounded clean, elegant, like a law that made sense of the world. In truth, it was the most perverse comfort ever offered to a desperate man. He had discovered it in a brittle law book borrowed from the courthouse at Street Francisville. The edges chewed by time, the ink faded to the color of dried blood. The passage described a principle older than the colonies themselves, that the status of a child free or enslaved was inherited from the mother, not the father. It had been designed to secure property lines in the old tobacco provinces of Virginia and Maryland, but its echo had carried through a century of commerce and cruelty, surviving every revision like a parasite. To Clement, reading by candlelight in his shuttered office, it felt less like law and more like revelation. He stayed up 3 nights straight, making notes in a new ledger, columns for investment, yield, interval. What he saw on those pages was not evil, it was arithmetic. If enslaved women could birth property, why not any woman, so long as the papers said she was one? The law didn't require truth, only documentation, and Clement had just met a man who could provide it. Bogard was not a name so much as a shadow in the alleys of New Orleans. The city crawled with men like him, scribes of the forbidden trade, forgers who knew how to mimic a parish clerk's hand or stain paper so it looked 10 years older. You could buy anything from Bogard: travel passes, baptismal certificates, proof of manumission, proof of birth. He worked out of a loft above a tavern near Peter Street, a place that smelled of rum and mildew. For $50 a fortune to some, a gamble to Clement Bogard could make a child vanish from one identity and reappear under another. Their first meeting took place in early March of 1860 in the back room of that tavern. The air was thick with pipe smoke. Bogard was pale, with watery eyes that never seemed to settle. He listened as Clement laid out the beginnings of his plan, carefully phrased as a matter of inheritance confusion. Bogard said little, only asked, "How old are the women?" Clement hesitated. "Young enough," he said finally. Bogard's pen paused. "Then the fee doubles. Youth makes people ask questions, but questions can be handled." He left that night with forged baptism records already in progress. In the flicker of the tavern lamps, Clement saw the reflection of his own hands trembling. Not with fear, with possibility. The journey back to Delaney Plantation took 2 days, and every mile he felt the idea solidify. A system, a design, a way to turn flesh into currency without ever leaving home. He began rearranging the world to fit it. He walked the fields with a new kind of attention, taking notes not on cotton growth but on the bodies that worked it. The men's strength, docility, endurance. The women, hips, age, health, whether they'd borne children, and how many survived. It wasn't lust that drove him. It was a colder appetite, control. He measured their lives as though they were breeding stock, his mind already dividing them into categories of use. Leia noticed first. Clement had begun asking questions that made her skin crawl about her menstrual cycles, her appetite, her past pregnancies. He couched it in false kindness. "You've been strong, Leia," he'd say. "Healthy stock like yours makes a household proud." She nodded because refusal was dangerous. But she told Tobias that night, whispering through the thin walls of the quarters. Tobias listened, jaw tight. "Something's coming," he said. "The master's building something in his head." Back in the big house, Joanna saw the outer signs but could not yet read their meaning. The ledgers multiplied, his handwriting growing sharper, almost elegant in its precision. She found a new set of keys on his belt, 5, not 3, and asked what they were for. "The office," he said curtly, "and some improvements in the quarters." When she pressed further, he smiled without warmth. "You worry too much about doors, Joanna. Worry about what's inside." At night, when Clement slept beside her, she could feel the tension under his skin. His dreams were full of motion, hands twitching, breath caught in muttered fragments of calculation. Once she woke to find him sitting upright, staring at nothing, whispering the same Latin phrase under his breath like a lullaby. She touched his arm gently. "Come back to bed," she said. He looked at her as though she were part of the dream. "It's all there," he murmured. "We've been fools not to see it. The law allows it." The law allowed many things in 1860, but what Clement Delaney planned would still have shocked even the cruelest of his peers. The South already tolerated slave-breeding farms, places where owners forced reproduction to meet market demand. But Clement's vision went further. He would turn the boundaries of kinship itself into an industry. His daughters, his slaves, even his unborn grandchildren, each a variable in his private economy of survival. He began to gather supplies. Linen sheets for birthing, which he ordered under Joanna's name. Barrels of salt, clean water casks, and medical pamphlets on obstetrics borrowed from Dr. McCormick's office under the pretext of education. He even acquired tinctures and herbs from a Creole healer in the city, herbs meant to regulate female cycles, increase fertility, reduce pain. She believed she was helping anxious daughters. Clement never corrected her. The neighbors saw only fragments, a man tightening his household, working hard to save a failing plantation. When he refused invitations to supper or card games, they called it diligence. When he stopped attending church altogether, they said debt had made him proud. Only the sheriff, Mullins, sensed the change ran deeper. He mentioned it once, gently, over brandy. "You're keeping too many secrets, Clem. Secrets get heavy." Clement smiled and refilled his glass. "Then it's a good thing I've grown stronger." At dinner, conversation dwindled. The girls whispered less now. They could feel their father's eyes like a weight pressing across the table. He no longer scolded them for childish mistakes, he simply watched. Once, when Arlene asked for new fabric for a dress, he stared at her a moment too long before answering, as if assessing more than her request. Joanna felt it like ice in her chest. He started keeping his daughters close, forbidding visits to neighbors, citing political unrest. Yet outside the house, Louisiana still carried on. Markets open, gossip traded, laughter spilling from taverns. The Delaney girls became ghosts within walls that had once echoed with piano music. Clement's transformation wasn't sudden, it was incremental, like rot beneath paint. He convinced himself he was acting out of necessity, that every father must protect his family's future. Other men sell their land, he told himself, but land runs out, blood doesn't. In his mind, the moral boundary blurred until it vanished completely. In the evenings, he sat by candlelight drawing diagrams of lineage branches and lines that linked names, arrows that looped back into themselves. He measured his daughters' lives by those lines, by what they could produce. He even wrote mock legal phrases in his ledgers. Issue transferable, maternal condition fixed. The language of trade slowly replaced the language of kinship. One night Tobias heard him outside the quarters, murmuring to himself as he paced. The overseer lantern in his hand swung in short arcs, lighting his face in pieces. Cycles, Clement said. Intervals, if timed right, 6 per rotation. Tobias didn't understand, not then, but the sound of that muttering half prayer, half arithmetic, haunted him for weeks. By April, Clement had ceased pretending to share a bed with Joanna. He moved permanently into his office, claiming the need for quiet study. Behind that locked door, the plan that had begun as a thought in Latin became a ledger of flesh. He listed names Arlene, Caroline, Frida, Lyra beneath columns titled Schedule and Yield. In his delusion, he felt almost noble. He would save them all, he told himself, the plantation, his lineage, even his slaves, who would remain fed and clothed because he'd found a way to make the system self-sustaining. To him, it was order from chaos. To everyone else, it was madness with a pen in its hand. That summer, when Joanna entered his office unannounced for the last time, she found on the desk a fresh page in his angular handwriting. Partus sequitur ventrum, the mother makes the slave. Below it, a list of names followed by figures and dates, as neat as a merchant's invoice. Joanna stepped back slowly, her breath caught. She didn't yet understand the full scope of what he intended, but she knew, in that moment, that the man she'd married was gone, and that something colder had taken his place. Outside, the cicadas sang their relentless summer song. Inside, Clement dipped his pen again and began sketching new lines on the page, dividing life into columns of profit and blood. The doctrine had found its disciple, and Delaney Plantation, once merely a struggling farm, was about to become a ledger made of human flesh. By midsummer of 1860, the Mississippi air itself seemed to sweat a heavy, damp heat that made even insects lazy. The river had dropped low, the banks cracked like old skin, and the Delaney fields stood pale under a sun that punished both man and soil. Yet inside the big house, Clement worked as though he had been given divine instruction. The shutters stayed closed, the lamps burned through entire nights, and the scratch of his pen became the pulse of the household. He called it reorganization. To outsiders, it sounded industrious. To those who lived beneath his roof, it felt like the slow tightening of a snare. He divided his property on paper, first marking which cabins would hold men and which would hold women, assigning numbers to each, as though he were planning stalls in a barn. The drawings spread across his desk, neat rows of rectangles labeled with names: Leah, Sarah, Ruth, Tobias, Eli. He drew connecting lines between some of them, pairing bodies with the same precision he once used to balance ledgers. Efficiency, he muttered, tapping his quill against the page. Controlled breeding improves the yield. Those words would echo for years in Lyra's memory, because she had been standing silently in the doorway, waiting for permission to speak. Clement hadn't noticed her at first. His eyes were fever-bright, fixed on his design. When he finally looked up, she stammered that dinner was ready. He nodded absently, dismissing her, but she had seen enough. That night, she whispered to Tobias, "He's drawing houses, but they ain't for cotton." Tobias said nothing, only clenched his jaw until it trembled. Clement's next step was the most grotesque form of preparation: inspection. He began to summon the enslaved women one by one to his office, under the pretense of evaluating their health for fieldwork. Dr. McCormick had given him medical pamphlets on maternal vitality, and Clement read them as though they were manuals for animal husbandry. He asked the women questions about their cycles, about previous pregnancies, about endurance and pain. He recorded every detail. It was science in his mind, calculation in the service of survival. For the male slaves, he used different criteria. He chose Tobias and 2 younger men, Isaac and Reuben, based on height, musculature, and what he called temperament. He promised better rations and shorter days in the field, but the look in his eyes told Tobias these were not rewards, they were warnings. Tobias understood he was being chosen for something, and that refusal might cost him his life. Meanwhile, Joanna watched the plantation's rhythm shift. Clement dismissed half the field hands from outdoor labor and ordered the construction of 3 small cabins behind the smokehouse. The carpenter asked if they were for storage. "For family use," Clement replied. The man didn't press further. Wages were wages. The cabins went up in less than a week, plain structures with narrow windows and thick locks. At the same time, Clement began imposing restrictions on his daughters. First, he forbade them to attend Sunday gatherings at neighboring plantations. Then he banned visitors altogether. He claimed it was for safety. "There are agitators about abolitionists stirring up the slaves," he said. The explanation satisfied no one but himself. He ordered the girls' letters censored for their own protection and collected their mail personally. Joanna protested once, gently, and earned a look that froze her into silence. In the following weeks, the household settled into a strange discipline. The girls rose early, worked indoors, and rarely saw daylight beyond the shaded veranda. When they asked their mother why their father was acting so strangely, Joanna could only shake her head. "He's under strain," she said. "Debt makes men cruel." But even as she spoke, she didn't believe it. The cruelty had become too organized. At supper, Clement introduced a new rule: silence until he finished eating. He said conversation distracted digestion. The daughters sat rigid, utensils trembling. When Joanna once tried to bless the meal aloud, he interrupted. "God helps those who help themselves." His voice was calm, almost tender, and that was what terrified her most. Then came the herbs. Clement began visiting a Creole woman named Marie Leclerc, known in New Orleans for her restorative tonics. He told her his daughters suffered from female weakness and needed regulation. Marie, believing she was helping, provided mixtures of angelica, black cohosh, and pennyroyal herbs used to balance cycles. Clement added them to his daughter's tea every evening. Within weeks, the girls' symptoms, cramps, nausea, dizziness began to align, their bodies moving in the same rhythm. He kept notes. Joanna noticed the pattern first. "They're all sick at once," she told him. Clement smiled faintly. "Then perhaps they'll recover together." The walls seemed to close in around that sentence. By July, Clement had transformed the plantation's daily routine. Work schedules were shifted. Women were sent indoors during the hottest hours, men at opposite ends of the property. He claimed it reduced conflict. What it really did was eliminate witnesses. The slaves felt the change like a weather front, something vast and silent approaching. They spoke of it in half-whispers, calling the new cabins the still houses, though no one yet knew what would be done inside them. One evening, Tobias tried to ask Clement about the new rules. "Master, the hands are confused," he said carefully. "They don't know where they're supposed to sleep come harvest." Clement's answer was cold and simple. "Where, I tell them." Then, almost conversationally, "You've been with me a long time, Tobias. You'll help me keep order." Tobias nodded because that was the only safe response. But when Clement turned away, Tobias looked at the ground and whispered, "God forgive me, I don't know what order he means." Inside the big house, Clement's daughters began to sense danger without knowing its shape. Arlene dreamed of locks clicking shut. Caroline started losing hair from constant anxiety. Freda, still too young to understand, grew restless and defiant, sneaking notes to Laia through the kitchen door. "Why is father always watching?" one of them read. "He looks like he's counting." Joanna's fears finally forced her into action. One night, when Clement was asleep, she crept into his office and opened the locked cabinet with the smallest of his keys, the one she'd stolen while he bathed. Inside lay his ledgers, pages upon pages of dates, names, and numbers. One page was titled Schedule of Confinements. Beneath it were her daughters' names, written in precise, ink-dark lines. She nearly dropped the book. For a long moment she stood frozen, trying to understand. Confinement could mean illness, or discipline, or childbirth. But as her eyes traced the columns, Arlene, month 10, Caroline, month 12, Freda, month 14, the air seemed to vanish from her lungs. She put the ledger back exactly where she found it, and fled to her room, clutching her throat to keep from screaming. Clement never mentioned the missing key. Perhaps he knew, or perhaps he trusted the fear he had already planted. Either way, he pressed forward with his preparations. By late August, the factory existed in all but name. The cabins were ready. The herbs had done their work. The men and women had been chosen. Only the final step remained, the one that would move his plan from imagination into flesh. That evening, as twilight bled over the fields, Clement stood at his office window, watching the last workers trudge toward their quarters. Behind him, his desk was laid out like an altar, the forged documents from Bogard, clean linens, vials of tonic, and a Bible open to Genesis. His hand rested on the page that read, be fruitful and multiply. He closed the book gently and whispered, "So I shall." In that moment, Delaney Plantation ceased to be a farm and became something else entirely, a place where law and kinship and madness converged into industry. The next sunrise would mark the first night of what Clement called the experiment, and for everyone under his roof it would be the beginning of hell. Autumn came late to Louisiana that year. The air cooled only enough to make the sweat dry on skin instead of drip, and mosquitoes hung stubbornly over the marshes. The cicadas fell silent one by one, leaving behind a kind of waiting quiet, a silence thick enough to hold what was about to happen. Clement Delaney chose the 1st of November, 1860, to begin what he called the first phase. He even noted the date in his ledger, in a hand so neat it could have belonged to a bookkeeper, not a father preparing to commit a crime against his own blood. He called his daughters to his study one by one. Arlene went first. She entered hesitantly, still smelling of the lavender soap her mother had made for her. Clement gestured toward the chair across from his desk, his tone mild, businesslike. "You're a woman now," he said, "and our family is in peril. I need you to help secure its future." Arlene didn't understand at first. She thought he meant marriage. Her cheeks flushed as she murmured, "You found a suitor?" Clement's smile was thin. "No, child. I've found a solution." What followed was not a conversation but a dissent. He explained in calm, practical sentences how debts threatened to take everything, how she could preserve the family by bearing fruit, how obedience was love. At first, she thought it was madness, then blasphemy. When she realized he was serious, her voice broke into pleading, then disbelief, then silence. When she refused, Clement locked her in her room. He left water, a crust of bread, and the weight of his words. For 3 days she remained there, her cries muffled behind thick doors, while he visited at intervals to remind her what duty meant. He alternated threats and tenderness, quoting scripture about sacrifice, showing her the plantation accounts, as if numbers could justify sin. By the 4th day, Arlene no longer screamed. When Clement returned that evening, she sat on the floor, knees drawn to her chest, whispering prayers. He told her she had chosen wisely. That night he summoned Tobias to his office. The conversation that followed would haunt Tobias until his dying breath. Clement spoke quietly, almost kindly, explaining that obedience was survival for Tobias, for everyone. "Do what I command," he said, "and you'll live to see your children free." Tobias stared at the floor, his voice shaking. "Master, please." Clement's expression hardened. "You'll do it, or I'll make an example of you before the others." When Tobias was dismissed, he went outside and vomited in the dark. He considered running that night but stopped himself. He knew what happened to runaway slaves. He also knew that if he fled, others would suffer in his place. The special cabin stood waiting at the edge of the trees, new boards already graying from the humid air, a single candle burning inside. That night, November 3rd, 1860, Clement led Arlene from the big house. Joanna saw them pass through the back window and felt her knees weaken. She didn't yet know the full extent of her husband's design, but instinct screamed at her that something unholy was about to happen. She ran to Clement's office after they left and found his ledger open on the desk. The entry was dated and precise. Phase 1, Arlene. Subject, Tobias. Estimated conception window, November 3rd to 7th. She closed the book and fled to her room, choking on bile. Outside, in the cabin, the candle guttered as the wind slipped through the cracks. Tobias stood motionless, fists clenched, every part of him at war with itself. Arlene stood in the corner, trembling, refusing to look at him. Then Clement's voice came from the doorway, calm and steady. "You will both do your duty." Tobias turned, his eyes wet with terror. "Sir, please." Clement's hand rested on the revolver at his hip. Now, what followed was not a moment to be remembered, but a wound that would never close. Tobias did what he was forced to do, and Arlene endured what no daughter should ever endure. When it was over, Clement recorded the hour in his book, as though it were the completion of a transaction. The next morning he spoke of it to Joanna as if it were ordinary farm business. A beginning, he called it. She tried to confront him, but he silenced her with a look so cold it made her step back. "You'll not question me again," he said. "You will pray for the prosperity of this house." Over the following days, Clement summoned Caroline and Frida. Caroline fainted before he finished speaking. Frida, young and furious, shouted that she would rather die. Clement slapped her so hard she fell against the doorframe. Then he locked them both in their rooms and posted Tobias outside as a guard, knowing the man's shame made him obedient. At night, Joanna could hear her daughters sobbing behind locked doors. She tried to steal the keys once, but Clement had begun sleeping with them under his pillow. She considered running to the sheriff, but how could she explain this? The law belonged to men like her husband. A wife's word against her master's would carry no weight. Liar, too, saw the change. Clement's gaze lingered on her now when she served meals, his questions about her body more direct. She told Joanna in secret, trembling, "He's choosing us like livestock." Joanna pressed her hands over her mouth to keep from screaming. By the end of November, the plantation had become a house of ghosts. The slaves moved silently, the daughters no longer spoke to one another, and Joanna wandered like a figure half dead. Even Dr. McCormick noticed something was wrong when he visited to treat a minor infection. The girls were pale, their eyes hollow. He asked Clement privately if there was illness in the family. "Only weakness," Clement said, "and weakness must be corrected." McCormick left unsettled, but he told no one. A doctor who pried into a planter's affairs could lose both patience and reputation. Through December, Clement continued his phases, recording them meticulously. Phase 2, Caroline. Phase 3, Frida. The cabins filled with whispers and weeping. Tobias performed each task under threat, then spent his nights outside staring at the river, whispering to God for forgiveness. Clement's mania deepened. He began referring to his daughters as subjects in his records, his handwriting sharp and upright. He installed stronger locks, ordered that the women stay confined during evenings, and forbade Joanna from entering their rooms without his permission. The smell of ink, candle wax, and sweat filled the house. The ledgers grew thick with numbers. By Christmas, Joanna had stopped sleeping altogether. She heard footsteps at all hours, Clement pacing, muttering, writing. She prayed for a storm to wash it all away, but none came. Then one morning, she found her eldest daughter kneeling in the hallway, hair disheveled, eyes distant. Arlene said softly, "He says we've saved the plantation." Joanna knelt beside her, trembling. "You've saved nothing," she whispered. "He's damned us all." But even as she said it, she knew there was no escaping what had begun. Clement had built a machine out of fear and obedience, and every person in that house had been trapped inside it. The first frost came the next night. Ice formed thin and brittle on the water troughs. Clement looked out at the fields glittering under the moonlight and smiled. "It's working," he said to himself. "Everything's working." He had no idea that what he called success was already rotting from within, that every entry in his ledger was another line written against his soul. And within those November nights, the Delaney family had crossed a threshold that no law, no God, and no repentance could ever undo. By the time the frost melted into mud, the year had turned 1861. The country itself was splitting apart, but on the Delaney plantation, war was only an echo beyond the fields. Inside, another war had already been won and lost Clement's will over every living soul under his roof. The house was quieter than ever. Even the floorboards seemed to learn silence. Joanna moved like a ghost between rooms that smelled of vinegar and old tears. Arlene rarely spoke. Caroline slept for hours and woke crying, and Frida stared out windows that no longer opened. Clement, meanwhile, was vibrant. He rose before dawn to study his ledgers, ate heartily, and spoke in the brisk tones of a man conducting ordinary business. When the first signs appeared, the nausea, the dizziness, he congratulated himself for what he called the fruition of Providence. Arlene was the first to fall ill. Joanna recognized the signs before her daughter could say the word. She begged Clement to fetch Dr. McCormick, but he insisted on waiting. "Nature knows what it's doing," he said. "I'll not waste money on panic." When the doctor finally came, Clement stood beside him the entire time, answering questions meant for Arlene. McCormick, nervous, performed a polite examination and confirmed what they both already knew. She was with child. Arlene cried quietly while he packed his bag. McCormick gave her a sympathetic look, then turned away. "Congratulations," he told Clement. It was the only safe thing to say. Clement recorded the diagnosis that night. Arlene confirmed conception, due early summer, valuation dependent on complexion and health. His handwriting was smooth, precise, confident. Within weeks, Caroline showed the same signs. Then Leah. Each time, Clement reacted the same way, with triumph, not tenderness. He kept a careful calendar, charting due dates in overlapping cycles and efficient rotation of human life. "If properly managed," he murmured one evening, 3 sales per year at minimum. He began corresponding with traders in New Orleans under false names. The war had tightened some markets, but the demand for children, especially those of mixed ancestry, remained strong. He learned the prices by heart: $200 for a healthy infant, $300 for one of lighter skin. Curious, he said once aloud, that purity diminishes value. Joanna, overhearing, felt bile rise in her throat. Leah delivered the news to the quarters, and the slaves fell into fearful silence. Tobias couldn't meet anyone's eyes. He carried guilt like a sickness, believing himself cursed. The others whispered prayers for the unborn, though they dared not speak of the white women involved. To do so was to court death. In March, the weather turned. Rain swelled the river until it licked the edge of the property. The damp crept into the big house, warping the doors and staining the walls. Joanna began keeping vigil outside her daughter's rooms at night. She would sit with a candle burning low, whispering fragments of psalms, her hands trembling. Sometimes she thought she heard movement behind the doors, a soft sob, a rustle of sheets, but she knew Clement would kill her if she interfered. When Arlene's time came, he insisted the birth happen at home. "No need to trouble the doctor," he said. "Everything is in hand." He had studied the manuals, after all, pages filled with diagrams and Latin terms. He laid out linen on the floor of a guest room, ordered water to be boiled, and locked the doors. Only Leah was allowed to assist. The labor lasted 2 days. Joanna could hear her daughter's screams through the walls, each one shorter than the last. When silence finally came, Clement opened the door with blood on his hands and a strange, satisfied smile. "A boy," he announced, "healthy." Arlene was pale as death, barely breathing. Joanna rushed to her, but Clement blocked the way. "She'll live," he said, "and when she does, she'll understand what she's done for us." He took the baby immediately, carrying him not to his mother but to the quarters. He placed the infant in the arms of Ruth, a woman who had lost her own child weeks before. "This is yours now," he told her. "Care for him as you would your own." Ruth didn't dare correct him. She held the baby and wept silently. The next day, Clement rode to town with a small leather case. Inside it lay a folded certificate forged by Bogard, naming the baby as the son of Leah, property of Delaney Plantation. The signature at the bottom belonged to a fictitious parish clerk. A week later, Clement sold the infant through an intermediary. The trader didn't ask questions. He never did. The payment, $250 in clean bills, arrived wrapped in newspaper. Clement used it to pay one of his creditors and noted the transaction in his book. Sale successful, proof of concept. Arlene never saw her child again. She asked only once, voice hoarse, "Where is he?" Clement replied, "Where he can be useful." Joanna tried to confront him that night. "You've damned your own blood," she whispered. Clement's face hardened. "You'll speak no blasphemy in my house. You think God gave us these burdens so we'd starve? I'm saving us, Joanna." His conviction frightened her more than his cruelty. In August, Caroline gave birth. Her delivery was worse complications, fever, heavy bleeding. Dr. McCormick was summoned too late to prevent damage. Caroline survived, but barely. Clement hovered nearby, not with concern but impatience. "She must recover," he said. "We can't afford downtime." McCormick stared at him in disbelief. "She's your daughter. She's my responsibility," Clement replied evenly, then lowering his voice. "And you'll keep what you've seen to yourself. $50 should suffice." The doctor hesitated, then nodded. Poverty was its own leash. He took the money, cursed himself, and left. Caroline's child, a boy with light hair, was sold within weeks for $275. Clement recorded it with satisfaction, noting favorable market conditions. Freda, the youngest, was the last. Barely 16, she endured her pregnancy in terrified silence. When her time came, her small body failed her. The child was born early, frail, gasping. Freda bled for hours. Leah begged Clement to fetch help, but he refused. "A weak branch doesn't bear fruit," he said. The baby lived. Freda did too, but not whole. She could barely walk afterward, her spirit broken, her eyes empty. Clement sold her child for $225. Afterward, Freda stopped speaking. She wandered the halls at night, whispering lullabies to air. Caroline took to her bed with fits of trembling. Arlene, ghost pale, sat by the window every evening as if waiting for something to return that never would. Joanna began drinking. At first it was sips of laudanum to sleep, then brandy from Clement's cabinet. She told herself she needed courage to endure the days. In truth, she drank to silence the screams that still lived in her head. By autumn, Clement's system ran like clockwork. He kept meticulous notes. Conception intervals, health observations, estimated sale dates. The plantation had become what he always wanted, a self-contained economy. He even spoke of expanding, of purchasing more young women once his finances allowed. Dr. McCormick avoided the plantation whenever possible, but Clement's payments bought his silence. Sheriff Mullins passed by twice that year, investigating rumors of strangeness, but found nothing, only a polite, exhausted family and a man of property with impeccable manners. The horrors remained invisible to everyone but those who lived them. By December 1861, Clement was making plans for another cycle. He called it the renewal. He began again with Arlene. When she realized he meant to repeat everything, something inside her finally broke. She stopped speaking entirely, her mind folding inward for protection. Joanna found her one morning staring at the fireplace, the ash cold, her hands trembling in her lap. Outside, frost settled over the fields again, soft as dust. In town, newspapers shouted of war and freedom, of men dying for causes. None of it reached the Delaney house. Here, the only war that mattered was the one Clement waged against his own blood, and he was winning. That winter, as the river turned to glass under the morning light, Clement opened his ledger and began a new page. Projected births. Spring 1860. 4 units. Expansion possible. Profitable. He dipped his pen, drew a careful underline, and smiled. The wind pressed against the windows, whispering through the cracks like something trying to get in or something trying to get out. By early 1862, the Delaney plantation no longer felt like a home. It was an institution of suffering hidden behind a facade of respectability. The big house still stood white and symmetrical against the dull fields, but its heart had turned mechanical, every room a cog in Clement's quiet machine. The cries of laboring women had faded into habit, replaced by a silence far worse. Arlene's second pregnancy began in January. Her body had not yet healed from the last, but Clement refused to wait. Strong stock must not rest too long, he told Joanna, as if speaking of livestock. Joanna begged him to let the girl recover. She is barely alive, she said. Clement's eyes flashed with a kind of pity that was worse than cruelty. Then she will be reborn useful, he answered. Caroline, though frail and often feverish, was next. Clement had calculated her cycle with precision, timing the next conception to ensure continuity. He wrote those words in his ledger, in a hand so steady it looked engraved. When Dr. McCormick saw the note during a visit, left open by mistake, he went pale. "This isn't medicine," he said quietly. "It's arithmetic." Clement smiled. The two are not so different. Both require precision. Freda, the youngest, was still broken from her first birth. She walked with difficulty, her hands trembling from constant pain. When Clement ordered her to resume duty, she fell to her knees, pleading. "Father, please," she whispered. "I can't." He looked down at her as though she were a stranger. "You can and you will." The first months of that year were a fever dream of repetition. The same herbs, the same silences, the same scheduled sessions. Tobias carried the weight of them all, a man hollowed out by obedience. He spoke little, his eyes sunken, his voice monotone. Once, he tried to run. He made it as far as the river before stopping. Something guilt, perhaps mercy, dragged him back. He told Leah that night, "If I run, it never ends. If I stay, it never ends either." She took his hand in silence. Clement noticed the cracks forming in his human machinery. The pregnancies were taking longer, the recoveries slower. He began experimenting with new regimens, changes in diet, forced exercise, herbal tonics to improve vitality. He measured his daughter's arms, their weight, even the clarity of their eyes, noting all of it in his ledgers. "We must maintain standards," he told Joanna. Her reply was barely audible. "You're killing them." He smiled without malice. Death is simply inefficiency. The war beyond the plantation began creeping closer, rumors of skirmishes along the Mississippi, of slaves fleeing north to join the Union lines. But Delaney refused to see the world shifting. "War," he said dismissively, "a distraction for fools." He cared only for the numbers in his ledger and the ticking clock of his daughter's bodies. By mid-year, his calculations began to fail. Arlene's second pregnancy was difficult from the start. Her body trembled with fever and infection. When Dr. McCormick visited, he warned that another birth might kill her. Clement dismissed him with a wave. "You doctors see weakness where I see will," he said. "The body follows the mind." Caroline, weakened by hemorrhage from her first birth, fell ill with a lung infection. Clement confined her to her room, claiming she was valuable property in need of protection. Joanna tended to her in secret, sneaking in food and water, singing softly when the girl's nightmares came. Caroline whispered once, "I can hear him counting, Mother, even when he's not here." Frida's condition worsened daily. Her spine curved from strain, her steps uneven, yet Clement insisted she was recovering. When she failed to conceive after 2 months, he grew furious, pacing the hallways, muttering about waste. He forced her to take stronger tonics, so bitter they burned her throat. Leah tried to hide the bottles, but Clement found them and struck her across the face. "You'll not interfere with progress," he hissed. The slaves felt the pressure too. Those not directly involved in Clement's breeding schemes were assigned to the fields under harsher conditions. Food rations dwindled, punishments grew swift. Tobias became a shadow of himself, silent but watchful. He began marking small X's in the dirt behind the cabins, one for every birth, one for every sale. By summer, there were more than a dozen. In July, the strain broke. Arlene went into labor early. The room filled with heat and the sour smell of sweat and blood. Joanna knelt beside her, holding her hand while Leah worked frantically to stop the bleeding. The baby was stillborn, a small, silent body with pale skin and closed eyes. Arlene didn't cry. She stared at the child, lips trembling, then turned her face to the wall. When Clement saw the lifeless infant, his reaction was fury, not grief. "You've cost me everything," he shouted. He struck the table so hard the lamp toppled, spilling oil across the floor. Joanna screamed as the flame caught, spreading briefly before being smothered. "You did this," she spat at him. "You killed him before he was born." Clement left the room without answering. That night, he wrote in his ledger, "Lost due to negligence, mother failed to maintain condition, must reinforce discipline." Caroline delivered her second child a month later. She nearly died in the process. Dr. McCormick worked desperately to stop the bleeding, whispering prayers between orders. When the baby's cry finally came, the doctor's relief turned to horror at Clement's response. "Good," he said flatly. "She lives. The child is proof of resilience." "Resilience," McCormick whispered. "You're bleeding your family dry." Clement turned to him with that same chilling calm. "Then they bleed for a purpose." The doctor left without taking payment. He would never set foot on the plantation again. In October, Freda's second pregnancy came to term. Her body was too weak to endure it. Joanna and Leah begged Clement to fetch help. He refused, insisting, "Providence favors the strong." When the birth came, Freda screamed until her voice broke. The baby survived. Freda did not. Joanna found her youngest daughter lying still, eyes open, her face frozen, in a final expression of relief. The baby, a girl, was taken from her arms before the body had cooled. Clement sold the child within a week. That winter, the plantation descended into quiet madness. Caroline stopped speaking altogether. Arlene rarely left her bed. Joanna drank until her hands stopped shaking, then drank more to make them start again. Leah worked with mechanical precision, her eyes hollow. Tobias prayed until his voice went hoarse. Clement, meanwhile, continued writing. Every night he sat in his office, surrounded by ledgers, dozens now each, filled with meticulous columns of names, weights, values. He no longer saw people, only output. He murmured as he wrote, as if reciting scripture: increase and multiply, yield and return. By Christmas of 1862, he was alone at his desk when a candle burned too low, casting shadows that danced across the walls like restless figures. He looked up once, startled by the movement, then laughed softly. "Ghosts," he said, "even they have their uses." Outside, the fields lay bare under the moonlight, the soil frozen and scarred. Every row marked a memory, every cabin a grave. And still Clement wrote. He wrote until the ink dried, until the pen scraped against the paper like bone. Output diminished. Loss of Freda, regrettable but acceptable. Reassess remaining subjects. Optimize intervals. He paused, then added one final line for the year. Success requires sacrifice. All enterprises do. The wind pressed against the windows as if trying to correct him, but Clement Delaney no longer heard anything human, not the cries, not the wind, not even the silence. Only the numbers. The first weeks of 1,863 were unseasonably cold. A grey mist hung over the delta, blurring the horizon into a single smear of damp sky and dead cotton. Frost rimed the fences and smoke from the slave cabins drifted low, refusing to rise. Inside the big house, even the air felt brittle, as though one loud word might shatter it. Joanna had stopped sleeping altogether. She wandered the halls at night with a candle stub, moving from door to door, listening for breathing. In Arlene's room, she found silence. In Caroline's, she found only the faint whimpering of a woman who dreamed of things too terrible to name. Freda's door, though, remained locked. Clement had ordered it so after the second birth. "The girl needs discipline," he'd said, But the sound behind that door had gone quiet days ago, and the quiet terrified her more than screams ever had. On the morning of January 15th, 1863, Laya climbed the narrow stairs to the attic to fetch linens that Clement had ordered cleaned. The air up there was heavy with dust and cold light. It took her eyes a moment to adjust. Then she saw the shape hanging from a beam, bare feet pale against the dark rafters, a twisted sheet biting into the neck. Freda. The scream that followed brought Joanna running, then Tobias, then half the household. Clement arrived last, moving at an almost leisurely pace, as if answering a call from far away. He looked up at the girl's body for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slow exhale, he said only, "Cut her down." Tobias did it, hands shaking so violently that the knot slipped twice before it came loose. Freda's body dropped softly onto the attic floor, light as rags. Joanna fell to her knees beside her, gathering the girl's head into her lap. The skin was cold, the lips faintly blue. There were bruises on her wrists, old ones, layered like rings on a tree. "She's gone," Joanna whispered. "She's gone." Clement's face remained blank. "Then the Lord has judged her weak." Joanna stared at him as if seeing him for the first time. "Weak?" Her voice cracked. "You call this weakness?" Clement turned away. "Prepare her for burial, quietly. We'll not have gossip." He left the attic without another glance. That night, the house became a cathedral of grief. Joanna sat by Freda's body until dawn, stroking the girl's hair and murmuring apologies that came too late. Caroline lay in bed trembling, clutching her rosary until her fingers bled. Arlene stared out the window, her mind gone somewhere beyond reach. When the sun rose, Joanna forced herself to dress the body. Laya helped her wrap Freda in a clean sheet, the same kind she had used to end her life. "She's at peace now," Laya whispered, but the words sounded hollow. Tobias stood in the doorway, eyes wet, shoulders bowed beneath the invisible weight of everything he'd been made to do. The funeral was small, hurried. Clement insisted on it. "No need for spectacle," he said. They buried Freda behind the magnolia tree, near the graves of the slaves. Joanna wanted her daughter beside the family plot, but Clement refused. "She forfeited that right," he said. The words struck like ice. Dr. McCormick was summoned to sign the death certificate. He examined the body briefly, noting the marks, the thinness, the hollowed cheeks. "Suicide?" he asked quietly. "That's what you'll write," Clement replied. "Melancholy, female fragility." McCormick hesitated. "These bruises?" Clement's voice hardened. "An accident. You'll sign." The doctor signed. His hand trembled. When the sheriff came a day later, he stayed only long enough to tip his hat and murmur condolences. "Terrible thing, Mr. Delaney," he said. "But such things happen with young ladies. Fragile nerves." Clement nodded, thanked him for his concern, and offered him whiskey. The matter was closed before it had even begun. But inside the house something had shifted. That night Joanna sat alone in her room, staring at the small fire in the grate. For the first time, her grief hardened into purpose. She realized that no one, no doctor, no sheriff, no God of the South would ever stop Clement. The law itself was his accomplice. If she wanted to save what remained of her daughters, she would have to become something she had never imagined. Her husband's executioner. She began to plan. In the days that followed, Joanna started moving carefully through the house, listening, watching. She spoke quietly to Laya in the kitchen, to Tobias in the yard. Both were haunted by what had happened, both desperate for an end. She asked no questions at first, only shared small truths. "He killed her," she said to Tobias one night. "He'll kill the rest of us too if we let him." Tobias looked at her, eyes hollow. "You mean to fight him?" "I mean to stop him." He nodded once, slowly. "Then I'm with you." Word spread quietly through the quarters. There were others who wanted justice or vengeance, or simply peace. They had all seen too much, carried too much shame. When Joanna came to them whispering through the half-open door of the smokehouse, no one refused. Arlene's third pregnancy had begun, though her body was too frail to endure it. Joanna knew it would kill her if Clement was allowed to continue. She promised herself that he would not live to see the child born. In late February, Clement began noticing the atmosphere on the plantation changing. The slave's eyes lingered too long. Conversations stopped when he entered. Even Joanna, once timid, met his gaze without flinching. He grew suspicious, ordering harsher punishments for minor infractions. He slept with his revolver within reach. "They're plotting," he told himself. "They want to take what's mine." His paranoia made him careless. He began to drink more, to leave the office door unlocked. Joanna studied his habits when he left, how long he stayed at the tavern, how much whiskey it took before his hand started to tremble. By April, the plan was complete. One night, under cover of a thunderstorm, Joanna met with Tobias, Leah, and 3 other trusted slaves in the barn. The air smelled of rain and horses. "When he rides out for his cards," she said, "you'll follow the road, wait near the cypress bend. When he returns, make it look like thieves." Her voice was steady, her hands weren't. Tobias hesitated. "If we're caught, we won't be," Joanna said. "He's protected by fear. It's time that ended." They agreed. Not for freedom, not even for justice, but for peace. On the evening of July 12th, 1863, the storm arrived. The sky turned the color of lead, thunder rolling across the river like artillery. Clement saddled his horse and rode toward the tavern, his coat flapping behind him. Joanna watched from the window, lightning flashing over his figure, and whispered, "Go on then, go to your fate." Hours later, when the storm was at its peak, Tobias and the others waited on the muddy road beneath the dripping trees. The sound of hooves came faint through the rain, then louder. Clement appeared, swaying slightly in the saddle, a lantern swinging from his hand. The ambush was swift. Tobias stepped from the shadows, grabbing the reins. Another man struck from behind. The horse reared, throwing Clement into the ditch. He shouted once, half a curse, half a plea, before the blow came. They left him there in the mud, face turned toward the storm. When it was over, Tobias knelt beside the body, rain washing the blood into the earth. "It's done," he said. They scattered his belongings down the road to mimic a robbery, even cutting the horse's flank to make the story believable. By dawn, Clement Delaney was officially another casualty of a violent and uncertain time. Sheriff Mullins would later call it a bandit's work. The townsfolk would nod, murmuring about the dangers of travel. No one would question it. But in the house, when Joanna heard the news, she did not weep. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, not for her husband's soul, but for her daughter's survival. Freda was gone. Arlene was dying. Caroline was broken. But at least now, the devil who had made their home a living hell lay cold in the mud. For the first time in 3 years, the Delaney women could breathe. And though the rain still fell that night, it sounded to Joanna not like mourning, but like absolution. When dawn finally broke over the Mississippi Delta, the storm had washed the land clean, or so it appeared. The river ran high and brown, swollen with debris, and the fields glistened under a pale, uncertain Sunday. Down on the Cypress Road, a farmer from Street Francisville found Clement Delaney's body sprawled face down in the mud, one arm twisted beneath him, his coat torn, his pocket watch missing. His horse limped nearby, bleeding from a shallow cut. By noon, the sheriff had arrived. Peter Mullins dismounted slowly, hat in hand, and stared at the corpse of the man he'd once shared brandy with. He crouched, turned the body, and saw the broken jaw, the skull caved just above the ear. Robbery, sure enough, he muttered to his deputy. Bandits have been thick these days. He wrote the words down like they were gospel and rode away satisfied. The war had made everyone careless with truth. Back at Delaney Plantation, Joanna played the role of widow with a precision born of terror. When the sheriff came to deliver the news, she pressed her hands to her mouth and let out a cry that startled even her daughters. "My husband, oh Lord, my poor husband." She didn't have to feign the trembling. Shock had its own momentum. Mullins patted her arm awkwardly, promised to send word if the culprits were found, and left before the coffee cooled. When the door closed, Joanna exhaled so deeply her body shook. Leah, standing nearby, understood without words. The women exchanged a single glance that held the entire history of their captivity, grief, guilt, and the first fragile breath of freedom. That evening, Joanna gathered everyone, her daughters, the surviving slaves, Tobias with his haunted eyes in the parlor. The air smelled of damp wood and lamp oil. "He's gone," she said simply. "You're all free. As of this moment, there are no chains on this land." At first, no one moved. Then Leah sank to her knees and began to sob. Tobias covered his face with his hands. Arlene whispered, "Free?" as if the word itself were foreign. Caroline started to cry quietly, the sound high and thin like wind through glass. Joanna didn't cry. She poured brandy into a glass, raised it to the flickering light and said, "To the dead, those we loved, those we couldn't save, and to the living, may we find a way to be human again." She drank it down in one swallow. Over the next weeks, the plantation seemed to breathe for the first time in years. Joanna sold off livestock and equipment, planning to settle her debts and leave Louisiana for good. She drafted manumission papers for every enslaved person remaining and handed them over one by one, sealing each with her husband's old stamp. "Take what's yours," she told Tobias. You earned it long before I found courage. Tobias nodded, eyes wet. I don't know what to say. Then don't, Joanna said, just live. By August, Arlene went into labor with her final child, the last conceived under her father's tyranny. The delivery nearly killed her. Joanna stayed by her side through the night, whispering comfort, while Leah wiped the sweat from her brow. When the baby's cry finally came, the sound seemed to split the air, shrill, defiant, alive. It's a girl, Leah said softly. Arlene turned her head weakly toward the sound. Don't let him take her, she whispered. He can't, Joanna said, tears falling for the first time in months. He'll never touch her, not ever again. For a few brief weeks, the house felt almost peaceful. Joanna moved through the halls without fear, and the remaining workers went about their days without the weight of watchful eyes. Tobias began preparing to leave, planning to head north where the Union Army's lines were rumored to be. Leah spoke of moving to New Orleans to start a dressmaking shop. But peace came too late for the Delaney women. The damage was done, carved into their bones. Caroline rarely left her bed, her mind trapped in a fog of memories. Sometimes she mistook the baby's cries for her own lost child and would start to rock the air, whispering lullabies to nothing. Arlene, though physically alive, never smiled again. She fed her daughter tenderly, but her eyes were distant, as though she were always somewhere else, perhaps in that November cabin, or the ledger where her father had written her name beside the word yield. Joanna did what she could. She sold the property in parcels, beginning with the outer fields. The buyer, a merchant from Baton Rouge, asked no questions. War makes men rich or dead, he said cheerfully. You're wise to sell. By autumn, only the big house remained, empty rooms echoing with memories. Joanna decided to burn it. She waited until dusk, gathered what little they owned, and led Arlene and Caroline outside. Tobias and Leah stood beside her, silent. Let it end, Joanna said. She struck the match herself. The flames climbed slowly at first, then roared through the dry timber, swallowing curtains, furniture, and ledgers alike. The night turned gold. Smoke rose in heavy columns, drifting across the fields that had once been stained by sweat and blood. No one spoke while it burned. Only when the roof collapsed did Arlene whisper, "Now he's truly gone." By winter, the family had scattered. Tobias headed north, following the rumor of freedom through war-torn roads. Leah left for New Orleans, where she opened a small shop and never again used the name Delaney. Joanna and her daughters moved south toward Mobile, renting a modest house near the docks. She told the neighbors her husband had died in the war, a hero lost to Confederate skirmishes. People believed her. They always did when the lie fit the legend. Arlene's baby grew into a quiet, solemn child with blue-gray eyes. Joanna raised her as her own granddaughter, telling her nothing of the truth. She called her Hope, and sometimes late at night, when the harbor bells tolled and the air smelled faintly of ash, Joanna would wake from half-sleep, convinced she heard the old house still burning, the crack of timber, the hiss of ink boiling from ledgers, the voices of all who had suffered there rising with the smoke. She would rise quietly, walk to the window and whisper, "Rest now, all of you." Behind her, Arlene's soft voice would come from the darkness. "He's gone, Mama. He can't hurt us anymore." Joanna would nod, though she wasn't sure she believed it. Men like Clement Delaney never truly died. They lingered in systems and silences, in laws that still bore the same Latin roots, partus, sequitur, ventrum. The child follows the condition of the mother. The words echoed down centuries, binding new flesh to old crimes. But for that night at least, there was quiet. And in that quiet, somewhere far from the ashes of the Delta, the women of Delaney Plantation slept without fear for the first time in their lives. Time, as always, conspired to erase. Within a few short years, the Delaney name faded from Louisiana records. The plantation lands were sold, divided, and renamed. New owners plowed over the graves behind the magnolia tree, planting sugar cane where the bones of the enslaved and enslaver alike rested together in unmarked earth. The big house, its charred foundation swallowed by vines, became nothing more than a shape whispered about by travelers who passed the Delta Road at dusk. Yet silence has memory. In 1865, when the war finally ended, the South woke to a reckoning it never truly faced. Freed men and women wandered the same roads where their ancestors had been chained, searching for families torn apart by ledgers like Clement's. Among them was Tobias. He had survived the war's chaos, moving north with a Union supply train, then back south again when the fighting ceased. For a time, he worked in New Orleans as a porter, quiet, reliable, always looking over his shoulder. He never spoke of the Delaney plantation, except once, to a preacher who asked why his eyes carried so much sorrow. "Because I saw a man count souls the way others count coin," Tobias said, "and I helped him do it." The preacher offered absolution. Tobias only shook his head. "Some things you don't get forgiven for. You just outlive them." He died in 1874, buried in a small churchyard with no marker. The local children said the ground there never grew grass. Leah lived longer. Her shop in New Orleans, La Maison de Leah, became known for its fine embroidery. To her customers, she was a quiet seamstress with gentle eyes. They never guessed that the steady hands stitching lace had once caught newborns as their mothers screamed for mercy. At night, she would hum the same low songs she used to sing in the quarters, lullabies for children who never grew old. When she died, her neighbors found a single trunk under her bed filled with baby clothes, too many for one lifetime. Dr. McCormick stayed in Street Francisville until the end of the century. He never married, drank too much, and was often seen staring into space during sermons. The townspeople called him melancholic, only he knew what that word really meant. Before his death, he confessed to a visiting priest that there had been a sickness of law, not of flesh, and that he had once been paid to ignore it. The priest absolved him. McCormick wept like a child. Sheriff Mullins retired, proud of his spotless record. In his memoirs, published briefly by his grandson, he mentioned the bandit killing of a planter named Delaney, but dismissed it in a single line: a robbery during those lawless war years, a regrettable but ordinary death. He died believing that story. As for Joanna and her daughters, they disappeared into history's softer corners, the ones reserved for women who survive. Joanna lived quietly in Mobile for another decade, selling hand-sewn dresses and reading her Bible every night. She never spoke of her husband. When she died in 1875, her headstone read simply, "Joanna Delaney, beloved mother, the Lord knoweth." Caroline outlived them all, though she barely seemed to notice. She spent her days near the window, hands folded, eyes distant. On good afternoons, she would hum lullabies. On bad ones, she spoke to the empty air, calling names that no one dared answer. Arlene's child Hope grew up believing her grandmother's lies. She was told her grandfather had been a soldier, her aunts victims of illness. She married young, moved west, and lived an ordinary life. Her descendants would never know that the blood in their veins had once been marked as property. But history, like the river, has a way of circling back. In the 1890 seconds, workers clearing land for a new levee near the old plantation site uncovered rusted chains embedded in the floor of a collapsed cabin. Beneath them, fragments of ledgers survived, ink bled but legible. The pages listed names and dates beside words like yield and sale. The local newspaper published a brief article. Curious records found in Delta ruins evidence of unsanctioned practices. No one investigated further. The South was tired of looking backward. Decades later, when the civil rights movement began to dig into the buried stories of the Deep South, a historian found that clipping in an archive. Her research uncovered the Delaney name, the forged baptism records, and a single court document signed by J. Delaney, widow. She realized what the law had hidden for more than a century, that the horrors of slavery had sometimes worn the face of family. That discovery became a small footnote in a larger book, easily skipped by readers in a hurry. But those who lingered on the passage could almost hear the echo beneath it, the faint whisper of a house creaking under heat, the rustle of paper turning in candlelight, the sound of a pen scratching numbers that were once human lives. In the Mississippi Delta today, there is no sign that the Delaneys ever lived. The earth reclaimed everything. The magnolia tree fell, the graves vanished under new crops, the road paved over. But locals still speak of a certain night in summer, when the wind shifts and carries a strange sound across the fields, a woman's voice, low and trembling, whispering names to the dark. They say if you stand very still, you can hear the faint chime of a piano from nowhere, a lullaby without words. Some say it's Joanna, some say it's Frida, others say it's the land itself, remembering what men tried to forget. Because some houses, once turned to factories of pain, never stop working. They keep producing echoes generation after generation until someone listens long enough to call them by their true names. And that is the legacy of Delaney Plantation. Not just a story of greed or madness, but a mirror held to a nation that once believed law could sanctify cruelty. The ledgers are gone, but the truth remains. It hides in bloodlines, in whispered prayers, in the quiet between thunder and rain. If you ever find yourself traveling the Delta Road at dusk, slow your step when you pass the old cypress bend. You might feel the air thicken, hear the hush of unseen breath. That's not imagination, it's memory. It's the sound of history refusing to die.